Welcome back to the Budget Gamer channel, where we bring you critical and in-depth reviews of just about every indie game we can get our hands on, and today we're going to be taking a look at Elden Path of the Forgotten for the Nintendo Switch. And this one is, if you haven't heard of it yet, pretty unique, and if you're a gamer like me who enjoys experiencing indies as the art form that they are, it is most certainly an appreciably unique game, even if it doesn't happen to tickle all of the fancies. And as you no doubt already know, I am fairly fancy. But leaning heavily away from that potentially endless negative feedback loop, let's jump into the story. Of which, I'm happy to say, one of the points of uniqueness for Elden is actually its story. But that is because in order to find the story, you have to read so far between the lines that the chasm you'll fall into could actually engulf the sun itself. And that is because there is absolutely no story, or at least no story that's ever explicitly given. The introductory scenes of the game show a person being possibly taken over by some sort of spirit, engrossed in the drawing of a magic circle, and then sucked into some other parallel dimension. And after that, we're given character controls, so nobody really knows what happened up to that point. And other than that, the only storytelling mechanics in Elden Path of the Forgotten are going to be the game's visuals, which are fairly sparse, a handful of unintelligible signs, and a horde of enemy combat. And so yeah, for a game to have such obvious otherworldly appeal and no narrative at all, pretty unique. Now whether that's a good thing or not, we might get into in the critiques. As I've already alluded to before though, the game is rife with real-time combat. And from the very beginning, you have your choice of weapons and even a couple items that you can pick up along the way. And so while initially you will be slashing, stabbing, and hacking any enemies that come across your path, as this is a pseudo-fantasical world, you'll also gain some magical abilities. However, one of the other quite interesting unique points is that this game has absolutely no hand-holding whatsoever. And if you've played other games with similarly low pixel counts, such as the Eternal Castle Remastered or maybe Another World, then you might be used to how explicitly unguided a game can be. There is a bit of a control scheme laid out for you in the pause menu, but other than that, you'll have to figure out absolutely everything on your own. And I do mean absolutely everything. There are no NPCs, and there are no legible signs or writings or glyphs in the game. And so even if you come across a locked gate that you need a key for, you won't know it until you probably accidentally find a key somewhere. And then maybe you'll think, oh, I wonder if this goes to that gate. And while there is an element of exploration, the maps themselves are fairly simple, so yes, the key probably does go to that gate. But continuing on that note of exploration, the game does have several different maps. And after navigating your way through a few different locked gates and finding your way to that most momentous occasion of entering the boss room, there will be a champion to face. And as you may guess from any other eShop game with tentacles draped over its own title, the bosses will be somewhat eldritch. But don't worry, because even though some people may say that the combat in this game is somewhat Dark Souls-esque, there are checkpoints and you don't have to pay for them. And since there really is no leveling up system, you don't really lose anything when you die. Not even items that you may have used to heal yourself in said boss combat. But pushing away from the game's general mechanics and looking at its outward presentation, visually, I'd have to say that Elden definitely has a bit of appeal. Now this probably won't hold true to anyone who's after more hyper-realistic graphics or anything above 16 bits. But if you are a fan of certain aforementioned cinematic platformers, then you might really get a kick out of the graphic style. Because despite the desolation of the areas you'll be playing through, they actually are quite vivid. And along with that visual pungence of emptiness and death, the soundtrack really goes a long way in finishing the final touches on painting that picture. But before you walk away with any of those impressions of the game, there are a few other things a player might want to note before diving into Elden Path of the Forgotten. And first and foremost is probably the narrative itself. As I already mentioned, it doesn't really exist. And so that's one of the crazy things about eldritch horror and Lovecraftian stuff is the mythos and the ethos and the story and wanting to find out more about these ancient gods where death does not die. And so it's kind of, I don't know, it's just kind of weird to have a game based in mythos and lore that has no story. But hey, it's novel and unique and I'm glad somebody tried it. Maybe it works. But the next note would most certainly be on the combat. It is quick to a point, and it is real time, and there are a lot of different enemies to engage with. But many of the enemies do seem a bit like an updated reskin with just slightly more powerful attacks. One of the cool things is that the different weapons you have access to actually affect different enemies in different ways, such as how attacking a slime blob with your sword will poison you because it's too close, so you should probably use a spear. But other than that, combat happens sometimes one at a time and sometimes in swarms, and no matter how far you get into the game, it's kind of the same. So once you do climb that initial combat learning curve, there's really not much more to develop as a player. And as I mentioned before, though the boss fights are difficult and their attack patterns do change, there are checkpoints and you don't really suffer any loss, so feel free to just whack at them until you figure it out. And the final note of critique would probably be for the game's maps, or its general layout. There are no signs to point you toward a direction, and there's really no way to identify where on the map you've been other than the huge slew of dead bodies you may have left behind. But as there is no experience to gain, there's no better weapon upgrades, even though you can develop skills. Pretty early on, maybe by your second or third area you're exploring, you realize there's not much incentive to actually combat anything that you can just avoid. And so in that sense, developing skills and becoming a master of combat is really only necessary for the boss fights. Which means, depending on what type of player you are, this could be a rather short or a rather long game. But, pushing away from the table for just a moment and taking a look at Elden Path of the Forgotten as an entire experience, I'd have to say, honestly, I liked it just as much as I didn't. There are elements that were great. I loved the visuals, I loved the exploration of novel areas, and I really did want to know what was going on. And in all honesty, I think that it was that vacuous story, or the lack thereof, that really kept me playing. Not the challenge of the combat, not the urge to fight more bosses, but that tiny nagging feeling of if I make it one step further in the game, I'm going to figure out who I am and what I'm doing. Now, do you ever get to learn those details? That's going to be for you to find out, because I don't spoil endings. But anyway, that does about bring us to the end of the review of Elden Path of the Forgotten, now on the Nintendo Switch. So if you enjoyed the review, or especially if you found it helpful, feel free to throw me a like or a comment to show your support, and don't forget to click that little bell icon when you subscribe to stay updated with the latest content. Because there are literally thousands of indie games flooding the eShop, and whether it's an easy hard pass or an absolutely unforgettable gem, chances are if it's on the Switch, you're gonna find out about it right here. But anyway, this has been The Budget Gamer, so as always, thanks for watching.